The Christmas Pudding Poisoning. Section 1. Christmas Eve at Hartwell Manor. The lane to Hartwell Manor had not been properly cleared since the snowfall began 3 days prior, and the motor car, a rather elderly Daimler belonging to Mrs. Emmeline Fortescue, lurched and groaned over the frozen ruts with all the dignity of a dowager navigating a crowded ballroom. Miss Jane Marple, seated in the back with a tartan rug across her knees and a carpet bag wedged firmly beside her, watched the Berkshire countryside roll past the frosted window with an expression of mild, contented interest. The hedgerows were thick with snow. Beyond them the fields stretched white and still under a sky the colour of pewter, and somewhere in the middle distance the spire of a village church rose like a dark finger, pointing heavenward. It was, Miss Marple reflected, precisely the sort of English winter landscape that one saw on Christmas cards. Beautiful, serene, and just faintly melancholy. "We're nearly there, Miss Marple," said Emmeline, from the front seat, twisting round with the anxious energy that characterized everything she did. She was a small, bird-like woman of 55, with bright, darting eyes and a habit of plucking at her gloves when she was nervous, which appeared to be most of the time. "You can just see the chimneys through the elms. Do you see? Just there, beyond the ridge." Miss Marple peered obligingly through the glass and made out, against the grey December sky, a cluster of tall Tudor chimneys rising above a stand of bare trees. Smoke curled from 2 of them, thin, purposeful columns that spoke of fires lit and rooms made ready. "How lovely," said Miss Marple. "There is something so particularly welcoming about chimney smoke in winter, is there not? It promises warmth and company, which are the 2 things one most desires when the world outside is so very cold." Emmeline smiled tightly. "I do hope you won't find the company too trying, Miss Marple. I ought to have warned you more thoroughly, perhaps. My cousin Honoria is not. Well, she is not the easiest of women, but she was so insistent that I come for Christmas, and when I mentioned that you and I had been corresponding, she said I must bring you along. She said—" Emmeline hesitated, and her fingers plucked rapidly at the seam of her left glove. "She said she wanted witnesses." "Witnesses?" said Miss Marple, with gentle curiosity. "Her word, not mine. She's rewritten her will, you see, again, and she means to announce the terms of it at dinner tomorrow, Christmas Day, to the whole family. She does this sort of thing, I'm afraid. She enjoys—well, I suppose one might say she enjoys the effect." Miss Marple said nothing to this, but her pale blue eyes, so often mistaken for vague or abstracted, sharpened with quiet attention. She had known women like that in St. Mary Mead, Petherick, for instance, who had rewritten her will 11 times in as many years, each revision a small act of war against one relative or another. It had not ended well for Mrs. Petherick, though the circumstances had been rather different. Still, the impulse was the same, the desire to hold power through the promise and threat of money, to keep one's family dancing attendance through uncertainty. It was, in Miss Marple's experience, a dangerous game, and one that revealed a great deal about the players. The Daimler turned through a pair of stone gateposts topped with snow-capped griffins, and Hartwell Manor revealed itself in full. It was a handsome house, Jacobean at its bones, with later Georgian additions that gave it an air of comfortable grandeur rather than austere magnificence. The facade was of warm red brick, darkened by age to the colour of dried blood, with mullioned windows that caught the last grey light of the afternoon. Ivy climbed the east wing in thick, tangled ropes, and the front door, a massive oak affair studded with iron, stood beneath a stone portico draped with garlands of holly ivy and trailing lengths of red ribbon. The gardens, what one could see of them beneath the snow, were formal and well kept, though a certain shabbiness had crept in at the edges, a crumbling section of balustrade here, an unpruned rose border there, that suggested the estate's fortunes were no longer quite what they had once been. A large Christmas tree, freshly cut from the estate's own woodland, stood in a stone urn by the front steps, its branches heavy with frost, and hung with glass baubles that clinked gently in the wind. A manservant met them at the door, a tall, grave individual named Harding, whose manner combined professional deference with the faintly proprietary air of a servant who had been with the household longer than most of its occupants. He took their coats, directed a younger man to see to the luggage, and led them through a panelled entrance hall that smelled magnificently of pine boughs, beeswax, and the faint, warm undercurrent of something spiced baking in a distant kitchen. The hall was decorated for Christmas with an enthusiasm that bordered on the theatrical. Swags of greenery hung from every beam. Candles stood in brass holders on every surface. A fire blazed in the great stone fireplace, above which hung a portrait of a stern-looking Elizabethan gentleman, whose roughened expression suggested he would not have approved of candles dripping wax on the mantelpiece below. Beside the fire, arranged on a settle padded with faded velvet cushions, sat a very old grey cat who regarded the new arrivals with supreme indifference. Miss Marple took it all in, the grandeur and the shabbiness, the warmth and the faint chill that crept from the stone floors, the smell of wealth and the evidence of its slow retreat, and felt, as she often did in such houses, that the building itself was a kind of character in the drama about to unfold. They were shown into the drawing-room, where the family had assembled for tea. It was a large, high-ceilinged room with tall windows overlooking the snow-covered south lawn. A fire crackled in the grate. A Christmas tree, smaller than the one outside but more lavishly decorated, with tinsel, glass ornaments, small wax candles not yet lit, and a somewhat battered angel at the top, stood in the bay window. The tea things were laid out on a low table, a silver pot, china cups, plates of sandwiches with their crusts removed, and a dark, rich fruitcake studded with almonds. And there, presiding over it all from a high-backed chair positioned with strategic command of the room, sat Lady Honoria Blackwood. She was 78 years old, and she wore her age like armour. Her face was strong-boned and imperious, marked with deep lines that spoke not of frailty but of a lifetime of decided opinions forcefully expressed. Her hair, iron grey and swept into a severe arrangement, was pinned with a jet brooch. Her eyes, dark, sharp, and glittering with an intelligence that missed nothing, swept over Miss Marple with frank appraisal. "So you are Jane Marple," she said. Her voice was deep, clear, and accustomed to being obeyed. "Emmeline has told me about you. She says you are clever. I hope that is true. I find myself surrounded by fools and liars, and I should like at least one person in this house who can see what is in front of her nose." "You are very kind, Lady Blackwood," said Miss Marple, settling herself into a chair near the fire with the unhurried movements of a woman who had long since ceased to be flustered by rudeness. "I am merely observant, which is not quite the same thing as clever, though it is sometimes more useful." Lady Blackwood gave a short, hard laugh. "Observant, yes? Well, you shall have plenty to observe this Christmas, Miss Marple. I have gathered my family around me, such as they are, and tomorrow I shall tell them what I have decided about my money. Some of them will be pleased, most of them will not, and all of them," she paused, and her dark eyes swept the room with a look that was part contempt and part something older and sadder, "all of them are waiting for me to die." The room, which had fallen silent at the arrival of the guests, remained so for a beat too long. Then Gerald Blackwood, Lady Blackwood's eldest son, cleared his throat from his position by the window and said, with forced lightness, "Really, mother, you do say the most extraordinary things." But Miss Marple had already noted the quality of the silence that had preceded his words. She had seen the glances exchanged across the room, quick, involuntary, immediately suppressed. She had observed the way young Mrs. Blackwood's hand had tightened on her teacup, the way the man standing by the bookcase had looked not at Lady Blackwood but at the floor, and the way Emmeline's fingers had resumed their anxious plucking at her gloves. It was going to be, Miss Marple thought with a small, quiet sigh, a very interesting Christmas. Section 2. The Gathering Storm. By the time the dressing gong sounded at 6:30, Miss Marple had formed preliminary impressions of everyone in the household, and she was troubled by none of them more than the household itself. That peculiar atmosphere of a family held together not by affection but by expectation, each member tethered to the matriarch by invisible threads of money and need. Gerald Blackwood, Lady Blackwood's elder son, was a man of 52 who had the ruddy complexion and slightly thickened build of a country gentleman, though he had not, as Miss Marple had quietly ascertained through tea-time conversation, lived in the country for some years. He had a flat in London, Mayfair, he mentioned, with the careful casualness of a man who wished to establish his prosperity. And he spoke of investments and opportunities in the vague, expansive manner that Miss Marple had learned, over many years of village observation, to associate with financial difficulty. He was hearty and jovial in that determined English way that could mask almost anything, and he laughed rather too often at his own remarks. His wife, Sylvia, was a different creature entirely. Tall, elegantly thin, with a face that had once been beautiful, and was now merely handsome. She moved through the house with the controlled precision of someone navigating a minefield. She was polite to everyone, and warm to no one. Her clothes were expensive. Miss Marple noticed a silk blouse, a good pearl choker, shoes that were new, but she wore them with the rigid care of a woman who feared she might not be able to replace them. She had greeted Lady Blackwood with a kiss on the cheek that landed in the air an inch from the old woman's skin, and Lady Blackwood had received it with a thin smile that contained no affection whatsoever. "Sylvia has expensive tastes," Lady Blackwood had remarked to Miss Marple, loudly enough for Sylvia to hear, "and Gerald has expensive habits. Between them they have managed to spend a rather remarkable amount of money that was not theirs to spend." Sylvia's smile had not wavered, but her eyes for just a moment had been absolutely murderous. Then there was Philip Blackwood, the younger son, the quiet one. He was 45, lean and dark where Gerald was fair and broad, with the watchful, slightly withdrawn manner of a man who had spent his life in the shadow of a more favoured sibling. He had been a schoolmaster, Emmeline had told Miss Marple, at a minor public school in Hampshire, and had resigned his position the previous year, under circumstances that were, Emmeline said with a meaningful pause, not entirely clear. He sat apart from the others, reading, or pretending to read, a leather-bound volume he had taken from the library shelf, and he flinched, almost imperceptibly, each time his mother's voice rose in the drawing-room. Philip's manner toward Lady Blackwood was one of studied deference, the kind that comes not from respect but from long practice in self-preservation. He agreed with everything she said. He laughed when she made a cutting remark, even when the remark was directed at him. And yet Miss Marple noticed that when Lady Blackwood was not looking, Philip's expression settled into something quite still and quite cold, the face of a man who had been keeping a very careful account of grievances for a very long time. The fourth member of the inner circle was Diana Caldwell, Lady Blackwood's niece. Gerald and Philip's cousin, a woman of 38 with copper-coloured hair, a quick, rather brittle wit, and a manner that vibrated with a restless, nervous energy. She smoked incessantly, lighting each new cigarette from the stub of the last, and she talked a great deal without saying very much. She had been, she told Miss Marple with disarming frankness, rather a disappointment to the family, a failed marriage, a failed business venture involving a hat shop in Bath, and a current existence that seemed to depend largely on Lady Blackwood's generosity, which was, Diana implied with a wry twist of her painted mouth, not so much generous as strategic. "Aunt Honoria likes to keep us all on strings," Diana said, stubbing out a cigarette in a crystal ashtray with more force than was strictly necessary. "Pull one here, tug one there. It's her great entertainment. She'll dangle the will like a carrot, and then change it again in February. She always does." "Does she?" said Miss Marple mildly. "Oh yes. This must be the 4th revision in 2 years. Last time she left everything to a cat's home in Bournemouth, just to see the look on Gerald's face." Diana laughed, but the laugh had a raw edge to it. "The trouble is, one can never quite be sure she's joking." The fifth and most unexpected member of the party was a young man named Oliver Rees, who was introduced as a friend of the family in a manner that suggested nobody was entirely certain whose friend he was or how he had come to be there. He was 29, fair-haired, good-looking in an easy, unfinished sort of way, with an open smile and a talent for making himself agreeable. He fetched drinks, offered cigarettes, complimented the decorations, and told amusing stories about a recent holiday in the south of France, with the fluent charm of a man for whom social performance was second nature. Miss Marple watched him closely. She had known young men like Oliver Rees in St. Mary Mead. Not many, for the village was small, but enough. There had been that young man who had come to stay with the Hargreaves one summer, so charming, so helpful, so attentive to old Mrs. Hargreaves, and it had turned out that he had been systematically forging her signature on cheques for the better part of 3 months. Charm, Miss Marple had long since concluded, was the most dangerous quality a person could possess, because it made one reluctant to look beneath it. Oliver, she noted, was particularly attentive to Lady Blackwood, pulling her chair closer to the fire, pouring her sherry without being asked, laughing at her sharp remarks with what appeared to be genuine delight. Lady Blackwood, for her part, seemed to enjoy his company with a warmth she extended to no one else in the room. It was Oliver she asked to adjust the wireless when the carol service from King's College came through too faintly. It was Oliver who sat beside her at tea, and it was Oliver, Miss Marple noticed with particular interest, whom Gerald Blackwood watched with an expression of barely concealed loathing. The final member of the household, not a guest but a fixture, was Miss Ada Pritt, Lady Blackwood's companion of 11 years. She was a woman of indeterminate middle age, plain, quiet, and so practiced in self-effacement that one could look directly at her and somehow fail to see her. She wore clothes of relentless beige. She spoke only when addressed. She anticipated Lady Blackwood's needs with the silent efficiency of a well-trained servant, though her position was, theoretically, something above that, a grey, uncomfortable middle ground between family and staff, that Miss Marple knew to be one of the loneliest positions in English social life. Miss Pritt, however, was not quite so invisible as she appeared. Miss Marple had caught her, during an unguarded moment before dinner, standing at the window of the small morning room, looking out at the falling snow with an expression of such concentrated unhappiness that it was startling in its intensity. And then, hearing a footstep, she had rearranged her features instantly into their customary mask of mild, obliging blankness, a transformation so swift and so complete that Miss Marple, who had seen a good deal of human concealment in her time, was quietly impressed by its proficiency. Below stairs, the household was managed by Mrs. Finch, the cook-housekeeper, a stout, formidable woman who had been at Hartwell Manor for 23 years, and who regarded the kitchen as her sovereign territory. She had been preparing the Christmas dinner since the beginning of December. The pudding had been made on stir-up Sunday, as tradition demanded, and had been maturing in the larder ever since, wrapped in muslin and fed periodically with brandy. Mrs. Finch spoke of the pudding with a reverence that bordered on the devotional, and she was, Miss Marple gathered from a brief conversation in the passage outside the kitchen, deeply suspicious of anyone who ventured near her domain uninvited. "I won't have people interfering with my kitchen," Mrs. Finch declared, her arms folded across her considerable bosom. "Not at Christmas. There's a way things are done in this house, Miss Marple, and they've been done that way since long before some of these people arrived to make trouble." Miss Marple had nodded sympathetically, and asked with gentle interest whether the Christmas pudding recipe was one that had been in the family a long time. "Lady Blackwood's mother's recipe," said Mrs. Finch, with the air of one invoking sacred text. "Handed down, I make it the same way every year. Suet, raisins, currants, candied peel, breadcrumbs, flour, eggs, nutmeg, cinnamon, a good measure of brandy and bitter almonds for flavour. Always bitter almonds. It's the thing that makes it special." "Bitter almonds," Miss Marple repeated, softly, almost to herself. Yes. That evening, as the household assembled for drinks before dinner, the women in their best frocks, the men in dinner jackets, the drawing-room blazing with firelight and candlelight, and the warm glow of the dressed Christmas tree, Lady Blackwood rose from her chair and commanded silence with a single sharp rap of her walking stick on the floor. "I have something to say," she announced, and her dark eyes moved from face to face with deliberate, unhurried assessment. "You are all aware that I have revised my will. The new terms will be read aloud tomorrow, after Christmas dinner. I have asked Mr. Pettigrew, my solicitor, to send a copy, and it is locked in the study safe. I tell you this now so that you may spend the evening reflecting on your behaviour, past and present, and considering whether you deserve what you are about to receive, or not receive, as the case may be." She sat down. The silence that followed was extraordinary, dense, suffocating, alive with suppressed emotion. Miss Marple, seated in a corner with her knitting, observed it all with the patient, unhurried attention of a naturalist watching creatures in their habitat. She saw Gerald's jaw tighten. She saw Sylvia's hand move to her pearls. She saw Philip look down at his drink. She saw Diana light a cigarette with fingers that were not quite steady. She saw Oliver smile, a small, private, satisfied smile. And she saw Miss Pritt, standing in the shadow by the doorway, close her eyes for a long, slow moment, as though absorbing a blow. Outside, the snow fell thicker now, covering the gardens, the lane, the surrounding countryside in a deep, white, muffling silence. The manor was cut off, a world unto itself, sealed beneath the winter sky. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She was making a pair of bed socks in pale blue wool, a simple, rhythmic task that left her mind entirely free to work on more complicated patterns. Section 3. The Pudding. Christmas morning at Hartwell Manor dawned grey and cold, with a fresh fall of snow that had blanketed the world overnight and turned the view from every window into a scene of pristine, almost theatrical beauty. The manor's chimneys sent up their columns of smoke into the still air. Frost traced elaborate ferns on the window panes. Somewhere beyond the village, the bells of St. Edmund's Church began their Christmas peal, clear, bright, insistent, carrying across the frozen fields with startling clarity. Miss Marple had risen early. As was her habit, she had dressed warmly, read her morning prayers, and spent a quiet half-hour at her bedroom window watching a robin, bold, red-breasted, proprietorial, hopping along the ledge in search of crumbs she had placed there the evening before. It was, she thought, a very pleasant way to begin Christmas Day, and she allowed herself a moment of simple, uncomplicated enjoyment before turning her mind to the less pleasant matter of the household below. The morning had a fractured quality. Some members of the family attended the service at St. Edmund's. Gerald and Sylvia stayed behind, pleading the cold, though Miss Marple suspected the true reason was a fierce whispered argument she had overheard fragments of through the wall of her bedroom, which adjoined theirs. The words had been indistinct, but the tone, accusatory on Sylvia's part, defensive on Gerald's, had been unmistakable. Diana came down late, looking pale and slightly hollow-eyed, and drank black coffee in the morning room without speaking to anyone. Oliver appeared in high spirits, freshly shaved and smelling of expensive cologne, and presented Lady Blackwood with a small, beautifully wrapped gift, a brooch, paste but pretty, which she received with evident pleasure. "You are a thoughtful boy, Oliver," she said, pinning it to her collar, "unlike some others I could name." Gerald, who had given his mother a box of handkerchiefs, turned a dull, angry red. The morning passed in the usual rituals of an English country. Christmas, gifts exchanged with varying degrees of sincerity, sherry consumed, crackers pulled, paper crowns worn with the strained good humour that the season demanded. Miss Marple received a pair of gloves from Emmeline, and a box of chocolates from Lady Blackwood. "You always give chocolates to people I don't know." "Well, it saves one the trouble of thinking," and she distributed her own modest gifts, lavender sachets, she had made herself, with quiet pleasure. But beneath the surface festivity, the tension was palpable. Lady Blackwood's announcement of the previous evening had done its work. Every conversation carried an undertow. Every exchange of pleasantries was shadowed by the unspoken question, what had the old woman decided, and who would benefit? Miss Marple noticed that Oliver had found an opportunity to try the handle of the study door, casually in passing, as though merely testing whether it was locked. She noticed that Sylvia had engaged Miss Pritt in an unusually long and friendly conversation, asking questions about Lady Blackwood's health, her sleeping habits, and her recent correspondence with the solicitor. Questions that Miss Pritt answered with careful non-committal vagueness. And she noticed that Philip, returning from church, had gone not to the drawing-room but to the kitchen passage, where he had stood for some moments in conversation with Mrs. Finch before being called away by his mother's imperious summons. At 1 o'clock, the household assembled in the dining-room for Christmas dinner. The room was magnificent. A long mahogany table, polished to a mirror shine, was laid with the Blackwood family silver, heavy, old, monogrammed pieces that gleamed in the light of 2 tall candelabra. Crystal glasses caught and fractured the candlelight. A centerpiece of holly, ivy, and red berries ran the length of the table, interspersed with small gilt pine cones. The curtains were drawn against the early winter dusk, and the fire in the grate cast a warm, shifting glow over the panelled walls, the portraits of long-dead Blackwoods, and the faces of their living descendants. Mrs. Finch had outdone herself. The meal began with a clear consommé, followed by roast goose with all the trimmings, roast potatoes, Brussels sprouts, bread sauce, cranberry jelly, and a chestnut stuffing that drew murmurs of approval, even from Sylvia, who ate very little as a rule. There was claret for those who wanted it, and water for those who did not, and the conversation, guided by Lady Blackwood's commanding presence at the head of the table, touched on the weather, the King's speech, the carol service, and the general state of the world, all without approaching the subject that occupied every mind in the room. Miss Marple ate modestly and observed extensively. She noted the seating arrangement. Lady Blackwood at the head, Gerald to her right, Oliver to her left, Sylvia beside Gerald, Diana beside Oliver, Philip at the far end, Miss Pritt tucked between Emmeline and the empty chair that would have been occupied by the vicar, had he not been required at evensong. She noted who drank freely and who abstained. She noted the quality of the smiles and the direction of the glances. She noted with particular interest that Oliver's wine-glass was full but barely touched, and that Diana, who had been drinking steadily since noon, was becoming flushed and reckless in her remarks. "I suppose we shall know our fates soon enough," Diana said, with a brittle laugh, as the goose was cleared. "Shall we have the pudding first, Aunt Honoria, or the sentencing?" "The pudding," said Lady Blackwood with a cold smile. "One should always have one's pudding before one's punishment. It sweetens the blow." The pudding was brought in by Harding with considerable ceremony, a great dark dome on a silver platter, wreathed in blue flames of burning brandy that danced and flickered in the dim room. A sprig of holly sat atop it like a crown. The flames cast strange, shifting shadows on the walls and on the watching faces, and for a moment the room was held in a kind of spell, the ancient, almost pagan magic of fire and feast and midwinter darkness. Mrs. Finch, who had followed the pudding to the dining-room door, watched its progress to the table with the fierce pride of a mother watching her child perform in a school pageant. Lady Blackwood was served first, as was her right and her insistence. A generous portion was cut and placed before her, and she regarded it with satisfaction. "My mother's recipe," she said, "the only thing of value she left me. Apart from her temper, Mrs. Finch makes it beautifully. One can taste the bitter almonds, that is the secret, you know. Most people leave them out, but they are essential. They give it depth." She took a large mouthful. She chewed. She swallowed. She took another. "Excellent," she said. "Quite excellent." The rest of the table was served. Conversation resumed, lighter now, lubricated by wine and the expansive warmth of a good meal. Gerald told a long, not very amusing anecdote about a Christmas he had spent in Scotland. Oliver complimented the pudding with practised grace. Sylvia pushed hers around her plate without eating. Philip ate steadily and silently. Miss Marple, tasting her own portion, found it rich, dark, and very good. The suet melting on the tongue, the dried fruits plump with brandy, the spices warm and complex. She detected the distinctive flavour of the bitter almonds, a faintly sweet, faintly sharp note beneath the richness, and she paused, her fork suspended, and looked at the pudding on her plate with an expression of thoughtful attention. It was perhaps 4 minutes after the pudding was served that Lady Blackwood set down her spoon. "I feel," she began, and then stopped. Her hand went to her throat. Her face, which had been flushed with the warmth of the meal, drained of colour with alarming speed, turning first white and then a faint, terrible grey. Her breathing became laboured, shallow, gasping, effortful. "Mother?" Gerald said, half rising. Lady Blackwood's body convulsed. Her hands gripped the edge of the table, knuckles white, and a sound came from her throat. Not a scream, but a low, choking rasp that was somehow worse than a scream. Her eyes, wide and dark and filled with a terrible understanding, found Miss Marple's face across the table and held it for a long, awful moment. Then she pitched forward, her face striking the edge of her plate, and was still. The silence lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then Sylvia screamed, a high, sharp sound that shattered the stillness like glass. Gerald leapt to his feet, overturning his chair. Diana pressed herself back against her seat, both hands clamped over her mouth, her eyes enormous. Oliver sat perfectly motionless, his face blank with what might have been shock, or might have been something else entirely. Philip rose slowly, his napkin still in his hand, and said, in a voice of remarkable steadiness, "Someone should telephone for Dr. Marsh." Miss Pritt was already at Lady Blackwood's side, lifting the old woman's head from the plate, feeling for a pulse at the papery wrist. Her face was very pale but very composed, and her movements were efficient and practised. "I don't think," she began, and stopped. She looked up. "I believe she is dead." Emmeline let out a small, distressed cry. Mrs. Finch, who had appeared in the doorway, clutched the frame for support. her broad face stricken. Miss Marple had not moved from her seat. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. Her eyes moved from face to face around the table with careful, unhurried precision, recording everything. Every expression, every gesture, every word spoken and unspoken. She noted that Gerald had gone to his mother, but had not touched her. She noted that Sylvia's scream had come a fraction of a second before the old woman's collapse was fully apparent, as though she had been watching, waiting, anticipating. She noted that Oliver's first movement had been not toward Lady Blackwood, but toward the study door, a reflexive glance so quick it might have been unconscious. She noted that Diana's shock appeared genuine, but that her eyes, above her clamped hands, were dry. She noted that Philip's calm was of the deep, practiced variety that comes from having rehearsed a moment many times in one's imagination. And she noted one other thing, small, seemingly trivial, but lodging itself in her mind with the quiet persistence of a burr caught in wool. When Miss Pritt had lifted Lady Blackwood's head from the plate, her hand had brushed the untouched portion of pudding remaining on the dish, and she had wiped her fingers on her skirt without looking, a quick, automatic gesture. But her eyes, in that unguarded instant, had gone not to Lady Blackwood's face, but to the serving platter in the centre of the table, where the remainder of the Christmas pudding sat in its silver dish, dark and gleaming and still faintly warm. It was a very small thing. But Miss Marple had built a lifetime's understanding of human nature on very small things, and she tucked this one away with the others, to be examined later, when the pattern began to emerge. Section 4. Innocent questions. Dr. Marsh arrived within the hour, a brisk, competent man in his 60s who had been Lady Blackwood's physician for 15 years, and who confirmed, with professional gravity and private dismay, that she was indeed dead. The cause, he said carefully, appeared to be consistent with acute poisoning, most probably from a cyanide compound, though he would not commit himself further without a post-mortem examination. The bitter almond scent about her lips, he noted, was suggestive. Bitter almonds, he said, frowning at the remains of the pudding, which had been left untouched on the table at Miss Marple's quiet suggestion. The pudding contains bitter almonds as a flavouring. I understand. It does, said Miss Marple, who had positioned herself in a chair by the dining-room fire with her knitting and an air of gentle, unobtrusive authority. Mrs. Finch uses them in accordance with a family recipe, but bitter almonds in the quantities used for cooking would not, I think, be sufficient to cause death. The taste would be overpowering, long before a lethal dose was consumed. What was added to this pudding was something rather more concentrated, I suspect. Dr. Marsh regarded her with the wary respect of a man who sensed he was in the presence of a sharper mind than his own. You may well be right, Miss Marple. The police will need to examine it. The police, in the person of Inspector Hewitt of the Berkshire Constabulary, arrived some 2 hours later, a solid, patient, moustached man who took careful notes, spoke to everyone with scrupulous politeness, and was, Miss Marple discerned almost immediately, somewhat overwhelmed by the social complexities of the situation. He was accustomed to pub brawls and petty thefts, and the occasional domestic incident, a poisoning at a country manor on Christmas Day, among people who spoke with the languid, clipped assurance of the upper classes, was rather outside his usual territory. Miss Marple, recognizing his difficulty, offered her assistance with the modest, self-deprecating manner that she had found, over many years, to be the most effective way of making herself indispensable to reluctant policemen. I am only an old woman, Inspector, and I know nothing at all about police matters, but I have been observing this household since yesterday afternoon, and I have noticed 1 or 2 small things that might perhaps be useful to you. Shall I share them? I should not like to interfere, of course. Inspector Hewitt, who had heard of Miss Marple through a colleague at Scotland Yard. The legendary Sir Henry Clithering had once described her, memorably, as the most dangerous woman in England. If you happened to be a murderer, accepted her help with a gratitude he was careful to disguise as professional courtesy. The household had been assembled in the drawing-room, where a fire burned and the Christmas tree stood in mocking festivity, its candles now unlit, its tinsel tarnished by the pole that had fallen over the house. Miss Marple, with the inspector's tacit approval, began to make her rounds. Not interrogating, never interrogating, but merely talking, as one does at a house party, moving from guest to guest with her knitting in hand and her manner so gentle, so diffuse, so apparently aimless that each person she spoke to relaxed into something like honesty before they quite realized what was happening. She began with Mrs. Finch, because cooks, in Miss Marple's experience, were repositories of household truth. She found her in the kitchen, red-eyed and defensive, fiercely scrubbing a roasting pan as though she could scour away the horror of the day. "Such a dreadful thing, Mrs. Finch," said Miss Marple, seating herself on a wooden stool by the range. "And after all your beautiful work on the dinner, the pudding was quite magnificent. I do hope you know that." Mrs. Finch's scrubbing slowed. 23 years I've made that pudding," she said thickly. 23 years and never a complaint. If someone put something in it, they didn't do it in my kitchen. I lock the larder every night, Miss Marple, and I keep the key on my person." "Every night?" said Miss Marple. "How very wise." "And on Christmas Eve, the pudding was in the larder then, of course, waiting to be steamed. It was wrapped in muslin, in its basin, on the second shelf, same as always." "And you locked the larder when you retired for the night?" "I did. At 10:30, same as always, and unlocked it again on Christmas morning. At 6 o'clock. I was up before anyone. The pudding needed 5 hours steaming, and everything was as you had left it?" "The muslin undisturbed, the basin in its place." Mrs. Finch hesitated. It was a tiny hesitation, barely a pause in the rhythm of her scrubbing, but Miss Marple caught it, as a fisherman catches the faintest tremor on a line. "Well," said Mrs. Finch, slowly, "now you mention it, the muslin was tied differently. I always tie a double knot. It's a habit of mine. Very particular about knots, I am. And this morning the knot was a single bow. I noticed it when I unwrapped the pudding, but I thought perhaps I'd been mistaken. One does get tired at the end of a long day, and Christmas Eve is always the busiest." "A single bow," said Miss Marple, thoughtfully. "Yes. That is very interesting, Mrs. Finch. Very interesting indeed. And the larder, does anyone else have a key?" "Only Lady Blackwood. She kept a spare on her chatelaine, the one she wore at her waist, old-fashioned, but she liked to have access to everything in her own house." "And where does Lady Blackwood keep her chatelaine at night?" "On her dressing table." "In her bedroom?" Miss Marple nodded, made a small appreciative remark about the excellence of the bread sauce, and moved on. She found Gerald in the library, standing by the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out at the snow-covered gardens with the fixed, unseeing gaze of a man whose thoughts were very far away. "Such a shock for you, Mr. Blackwood," said Miss Marple, settling into a chair with her knitting. "One's mother at Christmas. It is almost unbearably sad." Gerald turned. His face was composed but strained, and his eyes were bloodshot. From grief or from drink, Miss Marple could not yet determine. "It's ghastly," he said. "Simply ghastly. Who would do such a thing?" "That is what everyone is asking," said Miss Marple. "And I suppose the answer must lie in the events of the last day or so. You were here all of Christmas Eve, of course?" "Yes, we arrived on the 23rd, Sylvia and I, and on Christmas Eve evening, after your mother's announcement about the will. Did you happen to go downstairs at all? During the night, I mean." Gerald's hand tightened on his glass. No. I went to bed at about 11 and slept straight through." "How restful," said Miss Marple. "Sleep is such a blessing. Your room is on the first floor, I believe, near the head of the stairs." "Yes, the blue room. And you heard nothing during the night?" "No footsteps, no doors opening or closing. Nothing at all." Miss Marple smiled. "How fortunate. I am such a light sleeper myself. Every creak and whisper wakes me. I thought I heard someone on the stairs at about midnight, but I dare say it was only the house settling. These old buildings do make the most remarkable noises." She watched Gerald's face as she said this, and saw, just for an instant, something flicker behind his eyes. A tightening, a calculation, a rapid internal adjustment, before his expression settled back into its mask of grief and bewilderment. "I heard nothing," he repeated, a shade too firmly. Miss Marple moved to Sylvia next, finding her in the morning room, smoking a cigarette with the concentrated intensity of someone using nicotine as a substitute for composure. She asked gentle questions about the Christmas preparations, the menu, the table arrangements. and Sylvia answered with clipped, efficient brevity. But when Miss Marple asked, casually, whether Sylvia had happened to visit the kitchen at any point during Christmas Eve or Christmas morning, something shifted. The kitchen? Why would I go to the kitchen? Oh, no reason in particular. I only thought, you might have wanted a glass of warm milk perhaps, or a biscuit. I often do, when I cannot sleep. I slept perfectly well, said Sylvia. And then a moment later, as though the denial had been too quick, and she wished to soften it. Gerald snores, of course, but one gets used to it. Of course, said Miss Marple. And you didn't happen to see anyone else about? In the corridors? On the stairs? Sylvia drew on her cigarette. No, she said. Then, well, I did hear something. A door, I think. Downstairs, at about 11:30, but I assumed it was Harding doing his rounds. 11:30, said Miss Marple. Yes, that would be about right for Harding, I should think. Unless, of course, it was someone else. She left the thought hanging in the air, light and inconsequential as a feather, and excused herself with a gentle apology about needing to find her spectacles. Her conversation with Diana was brief but revealing. Diana, who had consumed a considerable amount of brandy since the discovery of her aunt's death, was in a state of voluble, slightly unfocused distress that made her far more forthcoming than she might otherwise have been. I didn't kill her, Diana said, before Miss Marple had asked anything of the sort. I know everyone will think I did. I'm the one who needed the money most, after all, and I'm the one who said dreadful things about her at dinner last week when I'd had too much wine. But I didn't. I couldn't. She was horrid, Miss Marple, truly horrid sometimes, but she was all I had. Without her, I'm well. She gestured vaguely at herself. I'm nothing really. I'm sure that isn't true, said Miss Marple, kindly. But tell me, my dear, the pudding. You were sitting next to Mr. Reese at dinner. Did you notice anything about the way the pudding was served? Anything at all unusual? Diana frowned with the exaggerated concentration of someone trying to think through alcohol. No, Harding brought it in. It was flaming, very pretty. He served Aunt Honoria first, then went round the table. Oliver made some joke about hoping to find the silver sixpence. That's all I remember. And the serving platter, it stayed on the table throughout. I suppose so, I wasn't really looking. Miss Marple patted her hand. Of course not. One doesn't, at Christmas dinner. One is thinking of happier things. But Diana's comment about the sixpence had lodged in Miss Marple's mind alongside the other fragments. The re-tied muslin, the chatelaine on the dressing table, the door at 11:30, Gerald's too firm denial, Sylvia's fractional hesitation. They were not yet a pattern, but they were the beginnings of one, and Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily as the pieces turned and shifted in her thoughts. Section 5, Patterns and Parallels. The afternoon wore on, grey and heavy, and the snow continued to fall. Hartwell Manor, already isolated, became more so. The lane impassable now, the telephone line intermittent, the world beyond the estate's walls reduced to a white, muffled absence. The household drew inward, contracting into the few heated rooms like a body conserving warmth, and the enforced proximity, the knowledge that a murderer sat among them, by the same fires drinking the same tea, created an atmosphere of strained, suffocating intimacy that no amount of forced conversation could dispel. Miss Marple used the afternoon productively, while the others retreated to their rooms or gathered in uneasy clusters in the drawing-room. She undertook a quiet, systematic exploration of the house, noting the layout of rooms, the positions of staircases, the distances between bedrooms and kitchen, and the number of doors, locked and unlocked, that stood between any given person and the larder, where the pudding had spent its final night. The geography of the house was significant. The kitchen and its attendant offices, larder, scullery, pantry, occupied the ground floor of the east wing, accessible from the main house through a baize-lined service door at the end of the ground floor corridor. The family bedrooms were on the first floor of the main house. Lady Blackwood's room was at the far end of the first floor corridor, with Miss Pritt's room immediately adjacent. Gerald and Sylvia occupied the blue room, nearest the main staircase. Philip was in the small room above the library. Diana had been given the chintz room, overlooking the garden. Oliver's room was on the second floor, in what had once been the nursery wing, the farthest point from the kitchen, but also the most private, with its own narrow back staircase that descended directly to the service passage. That back staircase interested Miss Marple considerably. She climbed it herself, testing each step for creaks. The fourth and ninth from the bottom groaned under her modest weight, and found that it emerged into the service passage, less than 20 feet from the larder door. A person descending from the nursery wing in the small hours of the night could reach the larder, tamper with its contents, and return to bed without passing through any of the main corridors, provided they had a key. A key! There were only 2 Mrs. Finch's, which she kept on her person, and Lady Blackwood's spare, which hung from the chatelaine on her dressing table. Miss Marple considered these facts quietly as she descended the back staircase, holding the banister with one hand and her knitting bag with the other. She found Oliver Reese in the billiard room, leaning against the table with his hands in his pockets, and an expression of studied nonchalance that did not quite conceal an underlying tension. "Mr. Reese," she said, "I wonder if you might help me with something. I have been trying to recall, were you acquainted with Lady Blackwood before this Christmas visit? Emmeline mentioned that you are a friend of the family, but I confess I am not quite clear on the connection." Oliver's smile was easy and immediate. "I met Lady Blackwood through Gerald, actually. We belong to the same club in London, the Dorados. Gerald introduced me to his mother about a year ago, and she took rather a shine to me. She invited me down for a weekend last spring, and again in the autumn. This is my 3rd visit. How delightful. And you have become quite a favourite of hers, I think. She's been very kind to me." "Very generous." "Generous?" Miss Marple repeated, her needles clicking. Yes, Lady Blackwood did seem to be a woman of generous impulses, when she chose to exercise them. "Tell me, Mr. Reese. You are staying in the old nursery wing, I believe, with its own staircase? How convenient that must be. One can come and go without disturbing anyone." Something passed across Oliver's face. Not guilt, exactly, but a sudden, sharp awareness, a recalibration. "I suppose so," he said carefully. "Though I can't say I've had occasion to wander about in the middle of the night." "Of course not," said Miss Marple, with a gentle, abstracted smile. "I was merely thinking aloud. These old houses have such interesting passages." She left him and found a quiet corner of the library in which to sit and think. The fragments were accumulating now. The retied muslin, the chatelaine, the back staircase, the door heard at 11:30, Gerald's lie about sleeping through the night, Sylvia's reluctant admission, Oliver's access and his careful charm, Diana's desperation, Philip's cold patience, Miss Pritt's concealed unhappiness, and the bitter almonds. Miss Marple's mind returned to the almonds with the persistence of a compass needle. Finding north, bitter almonds contained amygdalin, which the body converted to hydrogen cyanide. She knew this, as any keen gardener and reader of detective fiction would. In small quantities, as a flavouring, they were harmless, even pleasant. But a concentrated extract, oil of bitter almonds for instance, which could be obtained from an apothecary, or, in the countryside, distilled from the kernels of certain stone fruits, was lethal. A few drops added to a dish already flavoured with bitter almonds would be nearly undetectable. The existing flavour would mask the addition. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a horribly clever method, one that required knowledge of the recipe, access to the pudding, and the cold-blooded precision to calculate that the familiar taste would conceal the fatal dose. It reminded her, with a small chill of recognition, of something that had happened in St. Mary Mead many years ago. Not a murder, not quite, but a case of deliberate harm that had taught her a lasting lesson about the nature of domestic malice. Old Mrs. Crabtree had kept bees, and her neighbour Miss Brent had been in the habit of borrowing honey. One autumn, Mrs. Crabtree, who bore a grudge against Miss Brent over a matter involving a property boundary, had added a quantity of honey from rhododendron blossoms to the jar she gave her, rhododendron honey being mildly toxic and liable to cause unpleasant symptoms. It had not been a serious poisoning, but the principle was the same. The poison had been hidden within the expected, within the familiar, within the gift. "It is always the familiar thing," Miss Marple murmured to herself, her needles pausing. "The thing one trusts because one has always trusted it. The pudding that has been made the same way for 23 years. The recipe that never changes. Except that this year it did change. Not in the kitchen, but afterwards. Someone changed it." She was still thinking about this when Philip Blackwood appeared in the library doorway. He stood there for a moment, framed by the dark wood, his lean face shadowed and unreadable. Then he came in and sat down across from her, and said, in a voice that was quiet and very controlled, "Miss Marple, may I speak to you in confidence?" "Of course, dear." Philip looked at his hands. They were long-fingered, rather elegant hands, and they were quite still. "I didn't kill my mother," he said. "I want you to know that, but I also want you to know that I have a very good reason why I might have wanted to, and I would rather tell you myself than have it discovered by the police and misinterpreted." Miss Marple waited, her expression one of gentle, attentive patience. "I left my teaching position," Philip said, "because my mother arranged it. She wrote to the headmaster a letter detailing certain personal matters that she felt made me unsuitable for a position of influence over young men. The letter was not true, Miss Marple, or at least not true in the way she meant it, but it was effective. I was asked to resign. I have been unable to obtain another post. My reputation is destroyed, and my mother destroyed it." "I see," said Miss Marple, softly. "That is a very great injury. It is the worst thing that has ever happened to me. And yet," Philip's voice wavered for the first time, then steadied, "and yet I did not kill her. I came here for Christmas because she asked me to, and because I hoped, stupidly perhaps, that she might undo some of the damage, that the new will might contain some provision, some acknowledgement. I wanted justice from her, Miss Marple, not revenge." Miss Marple studied him for a long moment. "I believe you," she said. "But tell me, Philip, when you spoke to Mrs. Finch in the kitchen passage this morning, before dinner, what was it you discussed?" Philip blinked. "You saw that?" "I see a great many things, dear, most of them quite unimportant. But conversations in kitchen passages on Christmas morning do tend to attract one's attention." A faint, reluctant smile crossed Philip's face. "I asked Mrs. Finch whether my mother had seemed well in recent weeks. Her health, her appetite, her mood. Mrs. Finch said she had been in excellent spirits. Vindictive spirits was the phrase she used, and that she had been spending a great deal of time with Oliver Reese." "And did Mrs. Finch have an opinion about Mr. Reese?" "A strong one. She said he was one of those young men who smile too much and mean none of it. Her words, not mine, though I happen to agree." Miss Marple nodded slowly. The pattern was sharpening now, details clicking into alignment like the pieces of a well-made lock. Not complete, not yet, but the outline was emerging, and it was not quite the shape she had first expected. "Thank you, Philip," she said. "You have been very honest, and that is always helpful. Might I ask one more thing? Your mother's chatelaine, the one with the household keys, you knew where she kept it, on her dressing table. Everyone knew she was rather ostentatious about it, jangling the keys as though to remind us all that she controlled everything. Even the larder." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That is exactly what I thought." Section 6, The Second Secret. The discovery came on the evening of Christmas Day when Inspector Hewitt, acting on information that Miss Marple had gently steered in his direction, searched the bedrooms. In Oliver Reese's room, in the drawer of the bedside table, beneath a copy of a racing journal and a monogrammed cigarette case, the inspector found a document. It was a single sheet of heavy cream paper, typewritten, bearing the letterhead of Lady Blackwood's solicitor, and it was a draft, unsigned but clearly authentic, of the new will. The terms were extraordinary. Lady Blackwood had left the bulk of her estate, Hartwell Manor, the London properties, the investment portfolio, a sum in excess of £40,000, not to Gerald, not to Philip, not to Diana, but to Oliver Reese. Gerald received a modest annuity. Philip received nothing. Diana received a small bequest contingent on her remaining unmarried. Miss Pritt received a year's salary and a reference. The Cat's Home in Bournemouth received a token donation. The household absorbed this news in stunned silence, and then the silence broke apart into recrimination. "It's outrageous," Gerald said, his face mottled with fury. "The boy's been here barely a year. He's insinuated himself. He's a fortune hunter, a confidence man." "Oh, do be quiet, Gerald," Diana said wearily. "We've all been fortune hunting. At least Oliver was better at it." Oliver himself, standing by the fireplace with his hands clasped behind his back, maintained an expression of dignified distress that was, Miss Marple thought, almost convincing. "I had no idea," he said. "Lady Blackwood never discussed the terms of her will with me. I'm as shocked as anyone." "Are you?" said Sylvia, and the two words were edged with ice. But Miss Marple was watching Miss Pritt. The companion had been standing in her usual position by the door, half in shadow, and at the reading of the will's terms, her face had done something remarkable. It had not shown surprise. It had not shown dismay. It had shown, for one unguarded instant, a flash of pure, concentrated rage, directed not at Oliver, not at the will, but at the paper itself, as though the document were a personal enemy. Then the mask had descended again, smooth and bland and impenetrable, and Miss Pritt was once more the invisible woman, the beige fixture, the companion whom nobody noticed. But Miss Marple had noticed, and the rage she had seen was not the fury of a servant slighted. It was something far deeper and far more personal, and it altered the shape of the pattern in Miss Marple's mind with the sudden, decisive clarity of a key turning in a lock. She sought out Miss Pritt that evening, finding her in the small sitting room off the main corridor that served as her private retreat, a cheerless, poorly heated room furnished with cast-off pieces and a single bookshelf of devotional works. Miss Pritt was sitting very upright in a straight-backed chair, her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing. "Miss Pritt," said Miss Marple, sitting down opposite her, "I think you and I should have a conversation, a truthful one." Miss Pritt's expression did not change. "I don't know what you mean." "I think you do, dear. I think you have been carrying a very heavy secret for a very long time, and I think it is connected to what happened today. I am not the police, Miss Pritt. I am an old woman who has seen a great deal of unhappiness caused by secrets kept too long. Will you not tell me?" The silence stretched. Outside the wind had risen, driving snow against the windows in hissing, irregular gusts. The fire in the small grate popped and settled. "She was my mother," said Miss Pritt. The words came out flat and colourless, as though they had been compressed by years of suppression into their smallest possible form. "Lady Blackwood was my mother. I am her daughter, born before her marriage, given away, raised by strangers, and brought back 11 years ago as a companion because she felt, I suppose she felt some obligation, or perhaps she merely wanted someone to ring the bell for. She never acknowledged me. She never intended to. I was to live in her house, attend to her needs, be useful and grateful and silent, and never, ever claim what I was. And I did it, Miss Marple. For 11 years I did it." Miss Marple's needles had stopped. Her eyes, soft and blue and infinitely compassionate, rested on the woman's face. "And the will?" she asked, gently. "She showed me the terms last week. She wanted me to know. She wanted to see my face when I understood that she was leaving everything. Everything. To that boy. That charming, worthless, scheming boy who has been flattering her for a year. She said," Miss Pritt's voice cracked for the first time, a hairline fracture in the edifice of her composure. "She said it was what I deserved for being born at all." Miss Marple reached out and placed her hand, lightly, on Miss Pritt's arm. "I am very sorry," she said. "That was a cruel thing to do. A very cruel thing." "I did not kill her," said Miss Pritt, and now her voice was fierce. "I wanted to, God help me. I wanted to, but I did not." "No," said Miss Marple quietly. "I don't believe you did, but I think you know something about who did. Or rather, I think you saw something, perhaps without understanding its significance at the time, that would help me a great deal." Miss Pritt was silent for a long moment. Then she said, "The chatelaine, the keys. On Christmas Eve night, after everyone had gone to bed, I went to Lady Blackwood's room to bring her the sleeping draught she takes. Warm milk with a little valerian. She was already asleep. The chatelaine was on her dressing table, and the larder key was missing from the ring. Missing. Gone. I noticed because the ring was lighter than usual when I moved it aside to set down the glass. I counted the keys. There should have been 7. There were 6. The larder key, the small brass one, was not there, and in the morning it was back. I checked. 7 keys, all present." "What time was this when you noticed it missing?" "About 1/4 to midnight." Miss Marple nodded slowly. 1/4 to midnight, and Sylvia had heard a door at 11:30. Someone had taken the key before 11:30, descended to the kitchen, opened the larder, tampered with the pudding, and returned the key before morning. Someone with access to Lady Blackwood's room. Someone who knew the layout of the house. Someone who understood the recipe well enough to know that bitter almond flavouring would mask the addition of a lethal concentrate. "Thank you, Miss Pritt," said Miss Marple. "You have been very brave and very helpful." She returned to the drawing room with her thoughts in careful order. The will had provided a motive for Oliver, an overwhelming one, if he had known its terms. But it had also provided a motive for Gerald, whose inheritance had been gutted, for Philip, who received nothing, for Diana, whose future depended on a pittance, and for Sylvia, whose husband's financial ruin was now compounded by disinheritance. But the stolen key narrowed the field. The person who had taken it must have had access to Lady Blackwood's bedroom, which meant someone who could enter that room without arousing suspicion, a family member, a companion, or someone who had been in the room earlier in the evening. Miss Marple settled into her chair by the fire and picked up her knitting. The pattern was nearly complete now. She needed only one more thread. Section 7. The Trap. Miss Marple spent the following morning, Boxing Day, though no one at Hartwell Manor was in any mood to celebrate it, in what appeared to be a state of gentle, benign confusion. She pottered about the house, making vague remarks about the cold, asking Harding for extra blankets, and engaging various members of the household in conversations, so apparently aimless that no one could have suspected them of being anything other than the ramblings of an elderly lady trying to fill the uncomfortable hours. But every conversation was a probe, and every rambling remark was a carefully placed stone in the path she was building toward the truth. She spoke to Harding about the household routine: who retired when, who rose when, which doors were locked and which were left open. She spoke to the housemaid, a nervous girl named Betty, about the arrangement of the bedrooms, and whether she had noticed anything unusual on Christmas Eve morning. Betty, eager to be helpful and relieved to speak to someone who was not frightening, confirmed that she had found the back staircase door, the one that connected the nursery wing to the service passage, unlatched when she came down at 5:30, though it was always bolted at night. "Unlatched," said Miss Marple. "Not simply unlocked, but unlatched, as though someone had gone through it and not fastened it properly behind them." "Yes, miss. I thought Mr. Reese must have come down for a glass of water or something. He's the only one up in the nursery wing." Miss Marple thanked Betty and gave her a peppermint from the tin she carried in her cardigan pocket. Then she sat for a long time in the small morning room, watching the snow fall and thinking about doors and keys and the distinctive, almost undetectable scent of bitter almonds. At 11 o'clock, she put her plan into motion. She found Oliver in the drawing room, reading a newspaper, with the concentrated attention of someone who was not taking in a single word. She sat down near him, arranged her knitting, and began to speak in her mild, wandering way about Christmas traditions. "Such a lovely custom, the Christmas pudding," she said. "And Mrs. Finch's recipe is a particularly fine one. I was admiring the flavour of the bitter almonds, so distinctive. One cannot mistake it, can one? And yet, you know, I have been thinking about it, and it occurs to me that the flavour in the pudding was rather stronger than one would expect from the quantity of almonds in the recipe. Mrs. Finch uses a tablespoon of ground bitter almonds, she told me so herself, but the taste was more intense than that, almost as though something had been added." Oliver turned a page of his newspaper. "I'm afraid I'm not much of a cook, Miss Marple." "No, of course not. But you are, I think, rather knowledgeable about chemistry. Emmeline mentioned that you had some training. Something to do with a pharmaceutical concern, was it not?" The page-turning stopped. Oliver looked up, and for the first time the easy charm was absent from his face. In its place was something watchful, guarded, and very still. "I worked briefly for a chemical supplier," he said. "In a clerical capacity, nothing to do with chemistry itself." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "a clerical capacity. Of course, still one does pick things up, working in such an environment. One might learn, for instance, how to obtain certain substances, oil of bitter almonds, for example, a perfectly legitimate product, used in baking and confectionery, but in its concentrated form extremely dangerous. Lethal, in fact. A few drops would be sufficient." Oliver's face had gone very pale. "Miss Marple, I hope you are not suggesting—" "I am not suggesting anything, dear. I am merely making an observation. The police, of course, will make their own inquiries. Inspector Hewitt is a thorough man in his way, and I understand he has already begun checking the local apothecaries and chemical suppliers for recent purchases. These things leave a trail, you know. Signatures in ledgers, delivery records. Such a nuisance for anyone who might prefer their purchases to go unnoticed. She let this sink in, watching Oliver's face with the same quiet attention she might have given to a bird whose behavior she was studying. She saw the calculation taking place behind his eyes, the rapid assessment of risk, the weighing of options, the search for an escape route. "I think," said Oliver, standing, "that I should speak to a solicitor." "That might be very wise," said Miss Marple. "But before you do, I wonder if you might help me understand one small thing. You told me that you had never discussed the will with Lady Blackwood, and yet the draft was found in your room. How do you account for that?" "I can't. Someone must have placed it there." "Placed it there?" "Yes, that is possible. But who? And when?" "Your room is in the nursery wing, Mr. Reese. The back staircase is the only convenient access, and Betty, the housemaid, found the back staircase door unlatched on Christmas morning, as though someone had used it during the night and not bothered to secure it behind them. Someone in a hurry, perhaps, or someone who was not thinking clearly, because they had just done something that required a great deal of nerve." Oliver said nothing. His jaw was set, and his hands, Miss Marple noticed, were no longer in his pockets but at his sides, clenched into fists. "The curious thing," Miss Marple continued, in her gentle, relentless way, "is that the person who poisoned the pudding must have known the recipe. They must have known that bitter almonds were a standard ingredient, and that the additional flavour would be masked. They must have had access to the larder key, which hung on Lady Blackwood's chatelaine in her bedroom, and they must have had the means to descend to the kitchen unseen, tamper with the pudding, and return, all during the night of Christmas Eve. The back staircase would serve perfectly. It descends almost directly to the service passage." "You seem to have worked it all out, Miss Marple," said Oliver, and his voice, though controlled, had a new quality. A hard, bright edge, like steel drawn from a sheath. "But you've overlooked one thing. I had no motive. I didn't know about the will, didn't you?" said Miss Marple. And her pale blue eyes met his with a directness that was, for one moment, entirely ungentle. "Lady Blackwood was a woman who used her will as a weapon. She announced its revision publicly, to create anxiety and dependence. Is it likely that she would have made you her principal heir without telling you, without enjoying the gratitude, the obligation, the power it gave her over you? I think she told you, Mr. Reese. I think she told you precisely what she intended. And I think you realize that if she lived long enough to change her mind, as she had changed it so many times before, you would lose everything." The silence in the room was absolute. The fire crackled. Outside, a crow called once, harsh and sudden, across the white gardens. Oliver Reese looked at Miss Marple for a long time. Then he sat down, very slowly, and put his face in his hands. "She did tell me," he said. "You're right. She told me on Christmas Eve, after the announcement. She called me to her room and showed me the terms. She said I was to be her heir, her real heir, because I was the only person in this house who truly appreciated her. And she said that if I disappointed her, she would change it again in a heartbeat. And so you could not afford to let her live long enough to be disappointed." Oliver raised his head. His face was grey, drained of its colour and its charm, and suddenly he looked, not 29 but much older, old and tired and cornered. "I didn't," he began, and stopped. "I need to think." "I think," said Miss Marple, rising from her chair with the careful, unhurried movements of an old woman whose joints protested the cold, "that the time for thinking has passed, Mr. Reese. But I shall leave you to the inspector. It is really his business, not mine." She left the room and found Inspector Hewitt in the hall, where he had been standing, at her request, just out of sight but well within earshot. "Did you hear?" she asked. "I heard," said the inspector. "Is it enough?" "Not quite," said Miss Marple. "But there is one more thing. Section 8, the truth of the pudding." The household was assembled in the drawing-room at 4 o'clock that afternoon, at Miss Marple's quiet request and Inspector Hewitt's official insistence. The curtains were drawn, the fire was lit, and the Christmas tree stood in the bay window, with its ornaments catching the lamplight. A strange, almost surreal contrast to the gravity of the occasion. Candles burned on the mantelpiece. The scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air. Outside, the snow had stopped at last, and a thin, cold, lemony light lay along the horizon. promising a clear, bitter night to come. They sat in a rough semicircle, Gerald and Sylvia on the settee, Gerald's hands clasped between his knees, Sylvia bolt upright with her pearls at her throat, Philip in the wingback chair by the bookcase, very still, Diana on the window seat, with a glass she had not touched, Oliver standing by the mantelpiece, pale and silent, Miss Pritt in her usual shadow by the door, Emmeline beside Miss Marple, twisting her gloves, and Harding, who had been asked to remain, standing behind the inspector's chair with the impassive dignity of a man who had served this house through better days and worse ones. Mrs. Finch had been summoned from the kitchen and stood, arms folded, near the service door, her broad face set in an expression of fierce, watchful loyalty. Miss Marple did not stand. She sat in her chair by the fire, her knitting in her lap, and spoke in her usual gentle, measured way, a tone so mild, so unassuming, that it took several moments for the room to realize that what she was saying was, in fact, devastating. "I should like to tell you," she began, "a story about a Christmas pudding. It is not, I'm afraid, a cheerful story, but it is an instructive one, and it has the merit of being true. Lady Blackwood was a remarkable woman. She was intelligent, forceful, and in her way quite formidable. She was also, if you will forgive me for saying so, a deeply unkind one. Not cruel in the dramatic sense. She did not rage or strike, but cruel in the quiet, systematic way that is, in my experience, far more damaging. She used her money as an instrument of control. She used her will as a weapon. She gathered her family around her, not out of love but out of a desire for power. The power to reward, to punish, to manipulate, and to remind each of you, constantly, that your comfort, your future, and your self-respect depended entirely on her favor. She paused. No one spoke. Each of you had reason to wish her dead. Gerald, because his financial affairs are in ruins, and only his inheritance could save him. Sylvia, because she has been living beyond means that were already inadequate, and the disinheritance of her husband meant the loss of everything she valued. Philip, because Lady Blackwood destroyed his career and his reputation with a single malicious letter. Diana, because she was dependent on her aunt's charity and knew it could be withdrawn at any moment. Miss Pritt, Miss Marple's voice softened, because she had been denied the most fundamental of human recognitions, the acknowledgement of a mother. And Oliver, because he stood to inherit a fortune, but only if Lady Blackwood did not change her mind. Oliver stirred but did not speak. The method was clever, Miss Marple continued. Oil of bitter almonds, a concentrated extract of hydrogen cyanide, was added to the Christmas pudding at some point during the night of Christmas Eve. The pudding was stored in the locked larder. The key to the larder hung on Lady Blackwood's chatelaine, which she kept on her dressing table. Sometime before midnight, the key was taken. Sometime after that, the larder was opened, the pudding unwrapped, the muslin retied in a different knot, which Mrs. Finch noticed, and the poison added. The pudding was already flavoured with ground bitter almonds, which masked the addition perfectly. Lady Blackwood, who was served first, and who ate heartily, received a lethal dose. The rest of the table received portions from the unpoisoned remainder, for the poison, being a liquid, would have been applied to the surface of the pudding, and would have been concentrated in the first portion cut and served. A sound half gasp, half moan came from Mrs. Finch. "The killer knew the recipe," said Miss Marple. "They knew the tradition of Lady Blackwood being served first. They knew the layout of the house, the location of the key, and the route from their bedroom to the kitchen that would avoid detection. The back staircase from the nursery wing leads almost directly to the service passage. The door was found unlatched on Christmas morning. Oliver Reese was staying in the nursery wing. He had worked for a chemical supplier, and would have known how to obtain oil of bitter almonds. He had been told the terms of the will on Christmas Eve, and knew that his fortune depended on Lady Blackwood not living long enough to change her mind. The draft of the will was found in his room. The evidence against him is, on its face, compelling." She paused, and her needles, which had been clicking softly throughout, went still. "But it is wrong." The room contracted. Every face turned toward her. "The evidence against Oliver is too compelling," said Miss Marple, quietly. "Too neat. Too perfectly arranged. The draft of the will in his bedside drawer. Why would a man who had just committed murder keep such a damning document in so obvious a place? The unlatched door. Why would a murderer, having taken such care with the poison, neglect to secure the door behind him? The chemical connection. Why would a man with such a background choose a method that pointed so directly to his own expertise? These are not the actions of a careful killer. They are the actions of someone constructing a case against him. She looked around the room and her pale blue eyes came to rest, with quiet certainty, on Gerald Blackwood. "It was you, Mr. Blackwood," she said. Gerald's face went white, then red, then a peculiar, mottled grey. "That's absurd," he said. "That's the most ridiculous. I was in my room all night. Sylvia will tell you." "Sylvia heard a door at 11:30, said Miss Marple. "She assumed it was Harding. It was not. It was you. You went to your mother's room, you, her eldest son, who could enter without question, and you took the larder key from her chatelaine while she slept. You descended the main staircase, not the back stairs, that is where I heard footsteps at midnight, and you went to the kitchen. You opened the larder, unwrapped the pudding, added the oil of bitter almonds you had brought with you from London, purchased, I suspect the inspector will find, through an intermediary, and re-wrapped it. But you are not a man accustomed to kitchen work, Mr. Blackwood, and you tied the muslin in a single bow where Mrs. Finch had tied a double knot. Then you returned the key to your mother's room and went back to bed. But you had one more task. At some point, perhaps that same night, perhaps early the following morning, you placed the draft of the new will in Oliver Reese's room, to divert suspicion. You had seen the document. You may even have found it in the study before your mother locked it in the safe. She showed it to Oliver, but I suspect you saw it first. Perhaps through less legitimate means. You knew the terms. You knew that Oliver stood to inherit, and you knew that if Oliver could be made to look like the killer, the will would be contested, the estate would revert to its previous terms, and you, as the eldest son and the residuary beneficiary under the prior will, would inherit everything. The silence was total. Gerald Blackwood sat on the settee, his hands clasped between his knees, his broad, ruddy face the colour of cold ash. He did not speak. He did not deny. He looked, Miss Marple thought with a pang of something that might almost have been pity, like a man who had known for some time that this moment was coming and had exhausted all his resources of pretense. "You knew the recipe because your mother spoke of it often," said Miss Marple. "You knew the tradition of her being served first because you had sat at that table every Christmas of your life. You knew about the bitter almonds because your mother boasted of them. And you knew, because you have been watching your own financial ruin approach for months, that if the new will stood, you would lose everything. Not just the money, Mr. Blackwood. The house, the name, the position. Everything that you believed was rightfully yours." Gerald raised his head. His eyes were dull and strange. "She was going to leave it all to a stranger," he said. "Everything my father built, everything our family built, to a boy who had known her for a year, a boy who flattered her and made her laugh, while I, her son, her eldest son." He stopped. His mouth worked, but no more words came. Inspector Hewitt stepped forward. "Gerald Blackwood, I am placing you under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Lady Honoria Blackwood. I must caution you that anything you say may be used in evidence." Gerald rose. He looked at Sylvia, who looked away. He looked at Philip, who met his eyes with an expression of mingled horror and something that was not quite surprise. He looked at no one else. He went quietly. The room released its collective breath. Diana began to cry. Softly, helplessly. The tears of someone who has held herself together for too long. Miss Pritt stood in the doorway, her hands at her sides, and her face showed nothing at all, though her eyes were very bright. Oliver sat down slowly in the chair. Gerald had vacated and stared at the fire as though he had never seen flames before. Emmeline turned to Miss Marple with something like awe. "How did you know?" Miss Marple picked up her knitting. "It was the muslin knot," she said simply. "Mrs. Finch ties a double knot. She has done so for 23 years. A woman who goes to the trouble of poisoning a pudding and knows enough to use a substance that matches the existing flavour, such a woman would also know to retie the muslin correctly. But Gerald is not a man who pays attention to domestic details. He has never been in a kitchen in his life. He tied what came naturally, a single bow, and that small careless mistake told me everything. The rest followed. The framing of Oliver was clever but overreached. A guilty man does not keep the evidence of his motive in his bedside drawer, and a man who has been a guest in a house only 3 times does not know instinctively that the matriarch is always served first from the pudding. But a son, a man who has eaten that pudding at that table every Christmas since childhood, he knows without thinking. And it is the things we do without thinking, I find, that most reliably reveal who we are. She fell silent for a moment, her needles clicking in the quiet room. The fire crackled. The candles on the mantelpiece burned steadily. Through the window, the first stars of the evening were appearing in a sky that had cleared at last to a deep, cold winter blue. "It is a sad story," said Miss Marple, softly. "A story of greed and pride, and the terrible damage that is done when love is withheld and money is used in its place. Lady Blackwood was not a good woman, and she was not kind to the people who depended on her, but she did not deserve to die, and she did not deserve to die at Christmas, at her own table, poisoned by her own son with her own pudding. There is something particularly terrible about that, I think, the corruption of something that should have been warm and nourishing and shared. The pudding was meant to be a gift. Instead, it became a weapon." She looked around the room, at the weeping Diana, the silent Oliver, the stricken Philip, the invisible Miss Pritt, the loyal Mrs. Finch, and her expression held no triumph, no satisfaction, only the clear, compassionate, faintly sorrowful understanding of a woman who had seen over many decades exactly what human beings were capable of, and had never ceased to be moved by it. "In St. Mary Mead," she said, "there was a family, the Abbots, who quarrelled terribly over a piece of land. It went on for years, brother against brother, parent against child, all for a few acres of pasture. And when old Mr. Abbot died and the land was finally divided, neither brother wanted it any more. The quarrel had consumed so much that nothing was left to enjoy. The land lay fallow. The family never spoke again." She tucked her knitting into her bag and rose, slowly, from her chair. "Money is like that," she said. "It promises so much and it poisons so quietly, and by the time one understands what it has cost, it is always, always too late." She wished them a quiet good night and went upstairs, where the robin was waiting on the window-sill in the fading light, and the snow lay deep and white over the sleeping countryside, and the bells of St. Edmund's were ringing faintly for evensong. The end.